We're on DAF Pei Aleph Amid Aleph, and on the fourth line. We had said yesterday that if an islandess who is not subject to Yibum or Chalitza because she's not capable of procreation, if she does receive Chalitza, it's a null and void Chalitza, and therefore it does not passel her from marrying a Kohen. However, if one of the brothers of her husband, or of her deceased husband, has Bia with her, that brother passels her from the kahuna by making her into a zona. So the Gemara's understanding is Taima de Be'aluha, Halo Be'aluha, Halo, which means that the only thing that would taint her to a Kohen is intimacy with a man who was usher to her. But less than that, just leaving an islandess unto herself does not render her puzzle to a Kohen. So our Mishnah is lo command the lo Rebbe Yehuda. Our Mishnah therefore is not like Rebbe Yehuda. De'i Rebbe Yehuda ha'amar islandess zonahi. Because Rabbi Yehuda holds that an islandess, just by herself, without any action being done to her, is usher to a Kohen because she has a din of a zona. Now, let's clarify. An islandess did not do anything promiscuous, but she's nevertheless called a zona because, according to Rabbi Yehuda, any intimacy that is not with the possibility of procreation is an act of znus. And therefore, by definition, this woman is not permitted to a Kohen because she falls under the rubric of a zona. Not because of anything she's done wrong, but rather just because she's not capable of procreation. Now, we don't paskin like this, but the Mishnah is just, the Gemara is just pointing out that our Mishnah is not like this opinion of Rabbi Yehuda. Let's go on to the next Mishnah. Sris Chama Kohen Shanasa Bas Yisrael. Now remember, we had said according to Rabbi Akiva, a Sris Chama is a man who is capable of, or is allowed to be married to a woman. It's only a Sris Adam who has the din of a Krus Shafcha and a Petzua Daka. He's not allowed to be married to a Jewish woman. So if a Sris Chama marries a Jewish woman, Ma'achila B'Truma, he's allowed to feed her Truma. And the Gemara will ask, what's the Chiddush here? Rabbi Yossi v'Rabbi Shimon Omrim, Androginus Kohen Shanasa Bas Yisrael Ma'achila B'Truma. These two Tanoim are of the opinion that if a person is an androgynous, which means he has dual genitalia, and even though there's a suffix whether he's male or female or something, a third option, nevertheless, if he takes a wife, this androgynous is allowed to feed his wife truma, even though it's questionable whether this is even a marriage. Now, why that is, we'll discuss shortly. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Tumtum shenikra v'nimtza zachar lo yachlotz mipnei shehu kisris. Rabbi Yehuda now says, a tumtum, which is a man who has ambiguous genitalia because there's a membrane covering his genital area, if the membrane ruptures and that you discover that he has male organs, so then he still is not able to do chalitza. Why? Because we assume that because this was covered with a membrane, then he's a sris. We assume that he's a sris and therefore is not in the parsha of doing chalitza. And androgynous no say avalo nisa. And then the Mishnah says that androgynous is allowed to marry a woman. We allow him to stay married to a woman, but he's not allowed to marry a man. In other words, marriage to a man is considered to be either definitively a homosexual act, or at least a suffix of a homosexual act. But apparently we don't have the same concern for a androgynous marrying a woman. Rabbi Eliezer Omer, androgynous chayven alav skila kizachar. Rabbi Eliezer even goes further. He says that if an androgynous and a male have relations, then you get the death penalty because the Gemara will have to explain what Rabbi Eliezer is coming to add to the Tanakama. But the point is that he has a din of a male vis-a-vis this prohibition.
The Mishnah seems to be taking an approach that we consider androgynous to be male. At
least Rabbi Eliezer holds that way.
Is there a basis for that?
Well, we'll have to see in the Gemara. Let's take a look at the Gemara. We'll go through it one step at a time. Pshita. So first the Gemara's question is, you're telling me that a sris chama, remember, a sris chama is a person who's allowed to legally be married. Even though he's not in the parsha of Yibum or Chalitza, he's allowed to be legally married to a Jewish woman. So why would I think that he's not able to feed his wife truma if he's a Kohen? So mahu detema molid ma'achol shena molid einu ma'achil kamash malon. The Gemara's answer is very simple. You might have thought that the criteria that are required in order to feed your wife truma is that there's a possibility of procreation of little kohanim from this marriage. Because remember, we said that the Torah's pasuk, the pasuk in the Torah says Yelid Beso, that those who are born to the Kohen's house are allowed to eat truma. So you might have thought that it's only on the basis that his wife is going to bear him children that she's allowed to eat truma, and if he's not able to impregnate his wife, maybe he wouldn't be able to feed her truma. So kamash malan, that's not the halacha. As long as it's a legal marriage, then she's allowed to eat truma. Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Shimon Omer androgynous. They say that if an androgynous is married to a woman, that woman is allowed to eat truma. So Amar Reish Lakish ma'achila b'truma ve'ein ma'achila b'chazei v'shok. So Reish Lakish says that he's only allowed, this androgynous is only allowed to feed his wife truma, but he's not allowed to feed her sacrificial tithes, which are the chazei v'shok, the chest and the thigh that a person who brings a korban shlamim has to give the kohen, the chest and the thigh of the animal. So that, and the Kohen is normally allowed to bring that home and feed his family with that, but if he's an androgynous, he cannot feed his family that. Rabbi Yochanan Omer af machila b'chazei v'shok, and Rabbi Yochanan disagrees, and he says, look, if he can feed her truma, he can also feed her the chazei v'shok. U'l'reish lakish ma'ishna chazei v'shok deoraisa. What are you going to argue? That the reason, according to Reish Lakish, why do you distinguish between the chazei v'shok, that it's aser, and the truma that's mutter? Because maybe you'll tell me that the chazei v'shok is a tithe that the kohen is only entitled to eat, but it's a deoraisa kohen tithe, and therefore maybe there's a greater restriction, that since the Torah is the one who restricts the chazei v'shok only to a kohen and his family, and this is perhaps only considered a rabbinic marriage and not a biblical marriage, or maybe it's only a suffix whether the androgynous is a male or a female. Therefore, we have to be machmir midioraisa and consider him a female for these purposes, and that would be the difference. But the Gemara says, wait a minute, truma nami dioraisa, but truma is also something that only belongs to the kohen and his family on a biblical level, right? So why would you say there's a difference? So the Gemara says, hacha b'mayas kinan b'trum bizman hazeh derabanan. So the Gemara says, because Reish Lakish and Rabbi Yochanan will tell you that we're looking at the Mishnah as Bizman Hazeh. That when the Mishnah says that androgynous' wife is allowed to eat Truma, it's only today, after the temple is destroyed, where the laws of Truma are only Midirabanan. Aval Bizman Shebeis HaMikdash Kayim Mai Lo. So what are you going to tell me, Reish Lakish, that when the temple is standing, you're not allowed to give your wife the Truma because it's limited Midioraisa? So the Gemara says, "Adatani ein ma'achila b'chazei v'shok liflog v'lisni b'dida b'med dvar mamur b'truma derabanan aval b'truma deoraisa lo." Well, then the question is, why then did you, Reish Lakish, make a distinction between truma and the chazei v'shok? You should have made the distinction between two different kinds of truma. When do I say that the androgynous is allowed to feed his wife truma? It's only bizman hazeh when truma is derabanan. But when the temple is standing and the laws of Truma are midioraisa, then Reish Lakish would tell you, then I agree that an androgynous is not allowed to feed his wife Truma. That's what you should have said, Reish Lakish. Make a distinction within the laws of Truma itself to clarify your position more carefully. So the Gemara says, Hachanami ka'amar. So the Gemara says that really is what Reish Lakish means. Keshehu ma'achila b'truma bizman hazeh derabanan, ve'ein ma'achila bizman chazei v'shok, va'afilu b'truma derabanan dil ma'asi la'ochla b'truma deoraisa. So Reish Lakish really means as follows. Look, when I say that the androgynous, you can only feed her truma, but you cannot feed her the chazei v'shok, I mean to say that you cannot feed her any priestly tithes at a time when the chazei v'shok are extant, which means not only can you not give her the chazei v'shok, but even truma you cannot give a woman when the temple is standing and the chazei v'shok are extant. And the reason is because number one, chazei v'shok are deoraisa, and we're only allowed to be lenient for an androgynous' wife to give him the benefit of the doubt that he has a din of a male when it's only an isser derabanan to a non-kohen. Right, but when it's something that's midioraisa forbidden, like the chazei v'shok, we're not going to be mekel. And furthermore, says the Gemara, the reason why Reish Lakish phrases it this way is because there are certain kinds of truma that are midirabanan even when the temple is standing. So let's just clarify this. Truma bisman hazeh is the rabbanan according to Reish Lakish, but when the temple is standing, then there are certain kinds of produce that are subject to truma midioraisa, and other kinds of produce that are subject to truma midirabanan. The only types of produce that are subject to biblical tithing are wheat or grain, olives and grapes. Dagan, tirosh, v'yitzar are the only things that the Torah says are subject to truma midioraisa. All other produce, let's say fruit and vegetables, are only subject to truma midirabanan, even when the temple is standing. So what Reish Lakish is saying is that bisman hazeh, when there's no truma midioraisa, an androgynous is allowed to feed his wife truma. When the temple is standing at the time of the chazei v'shok, not only can you not give her the chazei v'shok, but you cannot give her any priestly tithes, even things that are only truma midirabanan. Why? Because you may confuse it with biblical tithes. If we allow the androgynous to give his wife, let's say, truma figs, he'll come to feed her truma olives, and he'll come to feed her the chazei v'shok. So that's what Reish Lakish means.
How's this concept of being half married? It's chal. Marriage is chal. So marriage is chal.
No, there are plenty of times you can have a suffix marriage, a suffix kiddushin, the suffix marriage.
This whole thing is considered a suffix marriage, or
well,
marriage is chal?
At face value, it's a suffix marriage, at least according to Reish Lakish, because we don't know whether he's male or female. Mm-hmm. You can't have a marriage between two females, right? Right. We don't. If I don't know whether this person is male or female, so then it's a suffix marriage, right? So now. Let's go on to Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan Amar Afma Achila B'Chazei V'Shok. And Rabbi Yochanan says, no, once I know that androgynous feeds his wife Truma, he can even feed her the Chazei V'Shok, because he holds that it's like a marriage deoraisa, right? It's a whole marriage, and therefore she gets to eat everything. So Amar Le Rabbi Yochanan L'Reish Lakish, Mi Savris Truma Bizman Hazeh D'Rabanan. So Reish Lakish's first challenge to Rabbi Yochanan's first challenge to Reish Lakish is, whoever told you that Truma Bizman Hazeh is only D'Rabanan? Where do you get this from? So Amar Lei in Sha'ani Shoneh Igol Ba'agulim Oleh. So I'm going to unpack this. I'm going to speak this out, even though the Gemara is going to unpack this over the course of the next Amud, but we need to at least understand on a cursory level what the Gemara is talking about over here. There's a Brisa. And the Brisa says you can accomplish bittul when you're dealing with an item that is a holy tithe. So there's a machlokas between Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish as to what holy item is being discussed in the Brisa. Reish Lakish's girsa in the Brisa is when you're dealing with a cake of figs. A cake of figs, this is the Reish Lakish's reading of the Brisa, you need 100 times the forbidden figs in order for the entire mixture to be permitted. Now, comes along Reish Lakish and says that the case that we're talking about is figs that are truma, that fall into 100 one fig cake that's truma, falls into 100 fig cakes that are chulin. And the Brisa says that it is batal. Reish Lakish says this is an indication that truma bisman hazeh is midirabanan, and the Brisa must be speaking about bisman hazeh after the churban. How can I prove this? Because Reish Lakish holds that the laws of bittul do not apply to a davar shebeminyan. We've learned this in Maseches BAYT already. What's a davar shebeminyan? Anything that has an intrinsic importance because it is sold by unit measure. When you buy a cake of figs, you don't say, give me a bunch of fig cakes. You say, give me 5 fig cakes, give me a dozen fig cakes. And therefore, the fact that it has a unit measure makes it important, and therefore, according to Reish Lakish, it's never batal. The only reason why, therefore, that the Brisa would say that a fig cake is batal is only because it's only an Isser D'Rabanan. So Reish Lakish says, this is my proof that Truma Bisman Hazeh is D'Rabanan. Rabbi Yochanan has a totally different reading, and therefore let's read now Rabbi Yochanan's statement. He says, so that's Reish Lakish's argument. He says, yes, Sha'ani Shona Igel Ba'agalim Oleh, because my version of the Brisa is that one fig cake that's Truma will be batal and a whole bunch of other fig cakes that are Chulin because of this idea that it's only an Isser D'Rabanan, right? And so So that's the argument. So Amar Lei, so Rabbi Yochanan responds to him, he says, V'halo ani shoneh chaticha b'chatichos ola. Mi savris kol shedarko limanos shaninu, es shedarko limanos shaninu. So Rabbi Yochanan's response is, you got that brisa all wrong. The brisa is not talking about fig cakes. The brisa is talking about pieces of kodshim meat. And therefore, the only context of the brisa is when the temple is standing, and we're dealing with an Isser Deoraisa. How then can we say that pieces of meat are going to be bottle if we're dealing with a Torah Dika prohibition, and we're dealing with a Davar Shebeminyan, something that is counted in unit measure? The reason is, says Rabbi Yochanan, is for a totally different reason. It's got nothing to do with saying bittul only works mid'Rabbanan but doesn't work mid'Oraisa. No, bittul works even d'Oraisa on things that are sold by unit measure when that's not the exclusive way that they are sold. And this is the difference of es shadarko limnos and kol shadarko limnos. Kol shadarko limnos means that occasionally an item will be sold by unit measure, but also occasionally you'll say to the butcher, give me a bunch of meat, or give me a bag of meat, or give me a box of meat, whatever it is, a slab of meat, right? So sometimes you buy it by pieces and unit measure, and sometimes you purchase it with a bunch, or by weight, or whatever it is. Right? So in that situation, Rabbi Yochanan says there's no difference between fig cakes and pieces of meat. Since they're not exclusively sold by unit measure, you can achieve bittul even mid'Oraisa. So this brisa is not at all indicative that truma bisman hazeh is only mid'Rabbanan. And so that's the argument between Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish. Rabbi Yochanan is of the opinion that Truma Bisman Hazeh is Deoraisa, and there's no indication from this brisa to the contrary. So now the Gemara is going to unpack this whole discussion. Mahi, what are you talking about? Ditnan. Misha hayilo chavile tilson shel kilei hakerem yidolku. So the first thing that the Mishnah says, and this is a Mishnah, where is this? It's a Mishnah in Orla, and it says that if a person has bundles of fenugreek that are usher because of kilayim, and because they've been planted in a vineyard, so they become usher, not only usher they become usher bahana, so there's no other option that you have, but you have to incinerate them. There's nothing you can do with them. Now, nisarvu ba'acheros kulan yidolku divrei Reb Meir. If they get mixed into other bundles of fenugreek that are not kilayim, then all of them have to be incinerated. It's not bottle. However, that's according to Rabbi Meir. V'chachamim omrim yalu be'echad u'masayim. That the chachamim say, no, that as long as you have 200 times the amount of permitted fenugreek versus the prohibited fenugreek, so we say yalu. We say that that it is bottle, that you can achieve bittul in that fashion, and because there's no problem with the fenugreek being sold by unit measure. Shahir Reb Meir Omer Kol Shadarko Limnos Mekadesh, B'Chachamim Omrim Eina Mekadesh Eish Elashisha Dvarim Bilvad, V'Rabbi Kiva Omer Shiva. So the machlokus between Reb Meir and the Chachamim is that Reb Meir holds that anything which is even occasionally sold by unit measure is not bottle, and therefore all of the fenugreek has to be destroyed. And the Chachamim say, no, only things that are exclusively sold by unit measure are not bottle, and there are only 6 such commodities, and Rabbi Akiva says there's 7. Ve'elu hein, and let's see what they are. Egoze prach v'rimoni badan, the first 2 are a certain kind of parachian nut and a badanian pomegranate, v'chavuyos stumos, or sealed barrels of goods, let's say a sealed barrel of oil, right? Those are exclusively sold by unit. And v'chalfei tardin ukluche kruv, and bunches of radishes or stalks of cabbage, v'dalas yevanis, and the 6th one is a Greek gourd or melon. V'Rabbi Akiva mosif afki shel bal habayis, and Rabbi Akiva adds the 7th item is loaves of bread baked by an unprofessional baker who always sells his loaves by unit measure. Now, the Brisa just clarifies Haru'uyan la'orla, orla l'kilei hakerem, kilei hakerem. Some of the aforementioned 7 items are subject to the laws of orla because they grow on trees, and the laws of orla are such that when you plant a new tree, you have to wait 3 years before the fruit is permitted. So of these items that grow on trees, like nuts and pomegranates, they're subject to the laws of orla, and therefore if they get mixed with other things, they will not be batel. And some of these items are subject to the laws of kilei hakerem, such as, cabbage or radishes and things like that.
How come beitzim aren't mentioned here?
Because beitzim are probably kol shedarko limnos. This would be part.
There's no one says give me a bag.
Right.
Ever.
No, just the opposite. In other words, eggs are sometimes sold by unit, like give me a dozen eggs, and sometimes they're said give me a bag of eggs. This is all a question of convention. You can't ask me what happens in the 21st century.
Today, a beitza would be called.
Probably a beitza today would be es shedarko limnos. I'm not sure. Right, but probably, unless you count egg whites, So and then the Gemara says, Rabbi Yochanan Savar, Es Shadarko Limno Shaninu, V'Reish Lakish Savar Kol Shadarko Limno Shaninu. So this is the machlokus. Rabbi Yochanan says only he paskins like the Chachamim, and only things that are exclusively sold by unit measure are not batel. And Reish Lakish holds like Reb Meir and says even if it's occasionally sold by unit measure, it's also not going to be batel. So that's the reason that brings them to different conclusions about what the Brisa means, or what the Mishnah and Orla means. So my chaticha. So what does Rabbi Yochanan mean when he says that the Brisa is talking about chatichos, about pieces of meat? Detanya chaticha shel chatos temeya shenis arva b'meya chatichos shel chatos tahoros b'chein prusa shelechem haponim temeya shenis arva b'meya prusa shelechem ponim tahoros. So ta'ale. So the Bryce explains we're talking about pieces of meat. If the pieces of meat are from a korban chatos, and one piece gets mixed in with a whole bunch of that is tameh, gets mixed in with a whole bunch of pieces of chatos meat that are tahor. Now, when a piece of chatos meat becomes tameh, there's nothing to do with it. It can't be consumed. It has to be destroyed. So, according to this, so the halacha is tala. It will become batel because it's kol shedarko limnos. It's only occasionally pieces of meat are sold by unit measure. And the same thing would be true as if you have a piece of bread from the lechem haponim, from the showbread, that becomes tameh. Nothing you can do with it. So if it gets mixed in with a whole bunch of other pieces of bread that are not tameh, that are from the lechem haponim, as long as you have 100 times the permitted substance over the prohibited substance, it'll be batel. Reb Yehuda Omer lo sa'ale, and Reb Yehuda disagrees, and he says no, you don't have bittul at all. Again, apparently because he holds like Reb Meir, who says that it's kol shedarko limnos. Avol chaticha shel chatas tahoros shenisarva b'meya chaticha shel chulin tahoros v'chein prusa shelechem haponim tahoros shenisarva b'meya prusa shel chulin tahoros divrei hakol lo sa'ale. However, this is where the Tanakama agrees to Reb Yehuda. If, let's say, you have a piece of chatas meat that's tahor, so it's permitted, it's permissible to a kohen, and it gets mixed up with 100 pieces of meat that are totally chulin, just that you buy from Sobeys. So in that situation, the Tanakama will agree that you don't rely on bittul to make this meat permissible and consider it chulin. Why is that? Why does he say that it's not batel and you have to treat everything like it's kachim, like it's holy sacrificial meat? He says because there's no big hefsid involved by considering it all kachim. All you're doing is you're limiting its access only to kohanim and only to be eaten within the confines of the Beis Hamikdash. No. In other words, the point is, okay, for that degree of inconvenience and small financial loss, we're not going to allow you to rely on the rules of bittul for that. And the same thing is if you have a piece of lechem haponim bread, that's tahor, that gets mixed in with a whole bunch of loaves of regular bread, so then we're also going to say don't rely on bittul in that case. We only rely on bittul, say the Chachamim, is if you'd be forced to destroy everything if there was no bittul. That's when we say, okay, so then it's batel. So the Gemara says, Katani mihas reisha tala. But you see from the reisha that you do rely on bittul. Why? Because it's eshedarko limnos, like the Chachamim say, and like Rabbi Yochanan says, if it's not exclusively sold by unit measure, so then it's okay. Amar Rabbi Chia Bereda Rav Huna b'nimocha. So Reb Chia says, in defense of Reish Lakish, no, this brisa is not necessarily a raya. Because you know what? Maybe the whole reason you rely on bittul is not because pieces of meat can be considered batul. Maybe Reish Lakish is correct. Maybe pieces of meat are not going to be batul because it's something that's occasionally sold by unit measure. But over here, the brisa could be talking about a case where the meat gets mixed in with each other and becomes mincemeat. It becomes totally dissolved. Like when you make a stew and you boil meat for a really, really long time, the meat disintegrates. So maybe we're talking about disintegrated meat. And that's the reason why there's bittul, because it's not a davar shebeminyan anymore. It's not something that can be looked at as units. Right? And that's the reason why. So the Gemara says, Yihachi my time of the Rebbe Yehuda. Well, if that's the case, then why would Rebbe Yehuda say over there that you don't have bittul? So the Gemara answers, Rebbe Yehuda l'taimei d'omer bin b'mino lo batul. That's for a totally separate reason. Rebbe Yehuda throughout Shas, in Maseches Chulin, in Maseches Orla, and plenty of other places, he holds that any time you have two things that are physically exactly the same species, even though halachically their status may differ, we don't say that you have bittul. Min b'mino is never batul. Okay, so the Gemara says, Avalo nimocha mailo saleh. So then what are you suggesting, Rabbi Chia? You're suggesting that according to this brisa, if the meat is not disintegrated, but rather is still intact in pieces, you're going to suggest that the brisa would agree that it's not batul according to the Chachamim. So adatani aval chaticha shel chatas tahora shnisarva b'meya chaticha shel chulin tahoros lo saleh niflog v'nisni b'dida b'amed dvar mamurim b'shani mocha avaloni mocha lo saleh. So the Gemara's question is a very legitimate question. Well then, again, you have to really clarify to the greatest possibility your position. And if your position is that bittul only works when the item is disintegrated, then the brisa should have clarified and said, when do we say that you can accomplish bittul in this situation is when the pieces are disintegrated. But when the pieces are not disintegrated and they're still intact, we don't rely on bittul. Why did the brises in the Seifa only contrast it to a case of where you have pieces of meat that are chatas, that are a piece of meat of chatas that's tohar, that gets mixed in with pieces of meat that are chulin? That's not a good contrast because you haven't clarified your position in the Reisha, which says that the only time that you have bittul is when the pieces are disintegrated. It would have been much more clear to us your position if you would have said, but that's only true when the pieces are disintegrated, but when they're not disintegrated, we don't say bittul. So again, the Gemara's question is, why does the Seifa, which contrasts and says that there's no bittul, why does it only talk about a case of when you have tohar kudshim meat that is mixed in with chulin? It should have said, in the same case, where a tamei piece of kudshim meat falls into other pieces of kudshim, you only have bittul when it's disintegrated, but not when it's not disintegrated. So the Gemara gives a very interesting answer. It says, tahoros b'tahoros adif le. The Gemara says, you're right. The author of this brisa had a choice. He could have chosen to contrast the case where you do have bittul to a case of where you don't have bittul when the pieces are not disintegrated and you're dealing with tamei meat. Or he could have also talked about a case of where the pieces are still intact and you still don't, and you don't have bittul because, or I'm sorry, where the pieces are disintegrated and you still don't have bittul. Why? Because everything is still tahor, and you don't rely on bittul unless you're dealing with something that's tamei. It was preferable to the Tana to address that case because in one respect that case is a bigger chiddush. And Rashi gives us the background. Rashi tells us that there's a Mishnah in Maseches Trumos that says that when two items that are tohor mix in with each other, truma tohora b'chulin tohorin hakol modim sha'olin, that when you have truma tohor that gets mixed in with chulin, everyone, both Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai, agree that you have bittul. So there's a chiddush here that even though when it comes to truma that is tohar, everyone agrees that you can have bittul. When we're dealing with something that is kudshim, we will not allow for bittul because it's only a minor inconvenience to the person to consider it all to still be kudshim. And that's the reason why the Tana over here chose to create that contrast, because even though we're dealing with something that's tohar, and normally with things that are tohar, you do accomplish bittul with things other than kudshim meat. When it comes to kudshim meat, there's a special chiddush that you don't rely on bittul when it's not absolutely necessary, and that's the reason why the Tana chose it. Could the Tana have chosen to discuss the contrasting case of where the pieces are still intact and not disintegrated? Yes, but he chose this because this also in itself has a chiddush too, that even though we're dealing with something that's tohar that gets mixed in with chulin that's tohar, nevertheless we don't rely on bittul. And we'll hold it here for today. Enjoy the last day of Hanukkah. Zos Hanukkah.